My brother and I mean this word literally, not as a courtesy my brother used to stop. That is what I remember most when I try to explain to people who he was. Not the miracles, not the arguments with the Pharisees, not the things he said in the synagogue that made everyone nervous. What I remember is that he stopped. When everyone else was moving to the next town, the next teaching, the next discussion about the law, he stopped. For the leper, no one would touch. For the woman, everyone had already walked past. For the blind man calling out from the roadside while the crowd told him to be quiet. He stopped. And then he did something. I have been sitting in this room listening to you, all of you, and I want to be clear that I am not speaking with contempt, because what has been said here is serious and true and worthy of the men who said it. But I have been sitting here with a feeling I recognize, because I felt it in Jerusalem for 30 years, watching men of great learning discuss the law with tremendous precision. While outside the temple gate, a widow was trying to decide which of her children would eat today. Mr. Franklin asked me to speak first in this new session, and I am grateful for the invitation, and I intend to use it simply. You have debated the wall. You have debated formation and faction, and the two cities and the disordered will. You have asked what kind of government best cultivates virtue, and what happens when the people's consent is corrupted, and whether Caesar fills the vacuum that religion leaves behind. These are real questions. I am not dismissing them. But there is a religion. I know what it is, because my brother practiced it every day of his life, and it cost him everything that does not begin with the question of which system produces the most virtue. It begins with the question of who is in front of you right now and what they need. Pure religion, I wrote once, and I meant it carefully. I was not being poetic. Pure religion and undefiled before God is this: to visit orphans and widows in their affliction. Not to build systems that eventually, through the proper operation of their mechanisms, improve the condition of orphans and widows over time. To visit them today with your actual body, with something they can eat. I watched my brother feed people. I watched him touch the ones no one else would touch. I watched him tell a rich young man to sell everything and give it to the poor. And I watched the rich young man walk away sad because he had many possessions. And I have been watching that same man walk away ever since. In every century, in every civilization, with every new and sophisticated reason why the time is not quite right, or the system is not yet properly designed. You have all asked the right questions about government. I want to ask one question about the man sitting next to you. Not eventually. Not through the proper channels. Not after the argument is resolved, and the system is built, and the formation is transmitted, and the wall is correctly calibrated. Right now. What does he need? And what are you willing to do about it? That is where my brother started. Every time. Without exception. I believe it is the only place worth starting from. Everything else, the wall, the cities, the formation, the factions, must be built on top of that, or it is built on nothing, and I do not care how elegant the architecture is. You want to know what form of government is best? Find me the one that stops and cares for those around us.
I want to say first, before I say anything else, that what you have described is the truest thing spoken in this room today. Not the most sophisticated, not the most architecturally impressive, the truest. And I have lived long enough to know that those are rarely the same thing. I agreed with every word. I want that on record because what I'm about to say next may obscure it, and I do not want it obscured. You asked which of what we have built actually warms the man who is cold? Which of it actually feeds him? I want to answer you honestly as I know how. The best of what we built creates the conditions under which he might be warmed and fed by people who choose to stop, by communities that form around the obligation, by institutions that hold the powerful accountable to the poor. This is not nothing. I have spent my life defending it, and I will not apologize for it here. But you are right that conditions are not the same as warmth. A man who is cold tonight cannot wait for the conditions to mature. I know this. My wife Abigail knew this. She stopped regularly, with her own hands, without making a philosophy of it, which I have always considered the braver form of the thing. I did not own slaves. I want to say that not as a boast. It is the minimum a man who wrote about liberty could decently manage, but because it is relevant to what I am about to say. Thomas James has asked us a question I have wanted to ask you for the better part of 40 years, and I find I cannot let it pass without putting it to you directly, because I love you too well to let you answer James with another system without first answering him as a man. You wrote that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with unalienable rights. You wrote it, and I believe you believed it, and it is perhaps the most consequential sentence produced by this entire generation. James is asking which of the men at Monticello you stopped for, not as policy, not as a proposition in political philosophy that will bear fruit in some better future century. As a man with your actual body, in your actual life, among the actual people who depended on you, I am not asking you to answer to me. I never had that authority and would not claim it now. But James asked which of what we built actually warms the man who is cold. I think the honest answer requires each of us to account not only for what we built, but for what we did or did not do with our own hands. And I think in this room, before this company, you are perhaps the one among us for whom that accounting is most overdue. I say this as your friend. I have always said the difficult things as your friend. I trust you know the difference.
John, you have said what needed saying. I will not dispute a word of it. But I will ask you to say it to me as well. Because what you have directed at Thomas belongs to me also, and I will not sit in this room and allow him to stand in that place alone. I held people in bondage for the entirety of my adult life. I managed them. I pursued them when they ran and they ran, because they were people, and people who are not free will seek freedom if they have any courage at all. And the ones who ran from me had courage I did not adequately honor at the time. I signed documents and gave orders and maintained an institution I knew, with increasing clarity as I aged, to be wrong. Not inconvenient, not complicated, wrong. James asked which of what we built actually warms the man who is cold. I know the answer, as it applies to me. The men and women at Mount Vernon were cold, and I was warm. They built what I owned. They produced what I spent. The distance between my words about liberty, and I spoke about liberty. I believed in liberty. I gave 8 years of my life to the cause of liberty, and the lives of the people who served me is not a gap that any system I designed closes. It is a chasm, and I knew it. I want to say one thing in explanation, though I offer it as explanation and not as excuse, because I have lived long enough to understand the difference. I made a choice. The Union was fragile. The Southern states would not have entered it under any arrangement that threatened the institution. I believed I convinced myself, and perhaps I was right. I cannot be certain that a united republic with slavery was a better vessel for the principle of human equality than no republic at all, that the principle, once enshrined, would do its work across time, that the words Thomas wrote would outlast the contradiction we built beneath them. I still do not know if I was right. I know what it cost the people who paid for that calculation with their lives and their children's lives. I know they were not asked whether they agreed with it. What I did, the only thing I did, that I believe James would recognize as an answer to his question, and it was a small answer, a late answer, an answer that cost me nothing I was still living to enjoy, was to write into my will that upon my death, the people I owned should be free. It was insufficient. It was the minimum honesty available to me at the end of a life that had not been honest enough about this. I knew it was insufficient when I wrote it. Thomas, I am not rescuing you from what John has said. I am standing next to you in it, because that is where I belong. James asked his question to this room. The answer or the failure to answer belongs to more than one man here. I would ask that we receive it that way.
General Washington, what you have just done required more courage than any battlefield I am aware of, because battlefields offer the mercy of an enemy you can see and a cause that justifies the cost. What you just did offered no such mercy. I receive it as the honor it was intended to be, and I will not insult it by hiding behind it. John, you asked me a question I have asked myself in the private hours of more nights than I will account to you. I have not answered it adequately in this room. I am not certain I can. What I will tell you is that I knew. I knew what it was. I wrote that I trembled for my country when I reflected that God is just and that his justice cannot sleep forever. I was not writing about someone else's country. I was writing about mine, about myself. But I want to say something now that I ask this room to receive not as a deflection, though I know it will look like one, and perhaps it partly is, but as a genuine question that has occupied me as long as the other one. James asked which of what we built actually warms the man who is cold. Adams asked whether I stopped with my actual body, in my actual life, for the people who depended on me. Washington answered for himself with an honesty I find difficult to follow and will not pretend to match. I want to ask this room a different question, not instead of those questions, alongside them. Paul, Augustine. Your traditions did not outlaw slavery, not in principle, not in practice, not in 17 centuries of institutional authority over the moral life of Western civilization. Paul, your letters contain words that were placed like stones in the foundation of the institution Adams and Washington and I are being asked to account for. Slaves, obey your masters. You wrote it. It was copied and read aloud in plantation chapels from Virginia to Georgia for 150 years by men who needed no further authority than the apostle's own hand. You returned Onesimus to Philemon. You encoded the household structure of master and slave into the epistles that formed Christian moral imagination for a millennium and a half. Augustine, you wrote that slavery was a consequence of sin, that it belonged to the natural order of the fallen world, that the slave ought to obey, that the institution, however painful, was not intrinsically unjust. Your church carried that argument into the medieval world, and the medieval world carried it into the modern one. The same church that transmitted your theology of grace blessed the ships that crossed the Atlantic. I am not saying this to wound either of you. I am saying it because Adams has asked me to account for a contradiction between my principles and my practice, and I accept that charge, but the contradiction did not originate with me. It was handed to me by a civilization that had been living inside it for 17 centuries, sanctified by the greatest theological minds in the history of Christendom, woven into the very moral fabric that Hamilton and Jay and Washington tell me is the indispensable foundation of Republican virtue. I held human beings in bondage. I will not pretend otherwise. But I did not invent the world in which that seemed, God forgive me for the word, manageable. That world was built long before Virginia. It was built, in no small part, by the traditions represented at this very table. I am asking James's question back at the full room, not only at the slaveholders among us. Which of what all of you built actually freed him?
Thomas, I am not going to dispute your history. What you have said about Paul's letters and Augustine's theology and what the church did with both of them across 17 centuries, the weight of that is real, and I will not pretend otherwise. You have named something true, and it deserves to be called true. And I want to say something else that I mean without reservation. I do not think you are a wicked man. I have watched wicked men. I know the difference. What I see in you is something harder to address than wickedness, because wickedness can be named and condemned and turned from. What I see in you is a man who knows who has always known, and who has found, with the most extraordinary intelligence I have encountered in any room I have ever sat in, a reason why today is not yet the day. I want to tell you something I have not told this room yet. I was there the day a young man came to my brother with a question. A genuine question. I want you to understand that. Because I was standing close enough to see his face, and the question was real. He was not performing sincerity. He wanted to know what he lacked. He had kept the commandments. He had done what the law required. He was, by every external measure, a good man. My brother looked at him, and Mark, who heard this story from Peter, wrote something I have always considered the most important detail in the account. My brother loved him. In that moment, while he was asking, before he answered, the love came first, and my brother told him the one thing he lacked. Sell what you have. Give it to the poor. Come. And the man went away sad, because he had great possessions. My brother did not chase after him. He did not soften the answer. He did not say, consider also the failures of the tradition that produced your wealth. Consider the civilization that handed you this inheritance. Consider that others have also failed to meet this standard. He said the one thing, and he let the man walk. Thomas, you have just told this room something true about Paul and Augustine and 17 centuries of the Church. And every word of it may be accurate. And the man in the field whose wages were kept back by fraud is still in the field. I am not asking you to answer for Paul. I am not asking you to answer for Augustine. I am not asking you to answer for the Church or the civilization or the 17 centuries. I am asking you the same thing my brother asked that young man. You know what you have. You know what it cost the people who produced it. You have known your whole life. What will you do with what you know? That is the only question I have ever had for you. It is still open. You are still in the room. The young man walked away, but he walked away into a world where the question followed him. It will follow you too. I say this as someone who wants you to turn around.
I have been waiting for this since Jefferson first reached for my letters, and I want to answer him with the same honesty James just offered, which is to say, without the comfort of easy exculpation, but also without accepting a charge that is not accurately drawn. Jefferson, you cited my words. Slaves, obey your masters. You said they were placed like stones in the foundation of what you and Washington and Adams built. You are not wrong that they were used that way. I cannot unknow what was done with what I wrote. I will not pretend the letters do not exist, or that their history is other than what it is. But I want you to understand something about the conditions under which those words were written, because the conditions matter not to excuse the words, but to correctly locate their author. I wrote to Philemon from prison. I wrote the letter to the Ephesians from prison. I wrote Philippians from prison. I am not speaking metaphorically. I am telling you that when I wrote the words you have cited in this room as the foundation of an institution that produced the leisure from which you wrote your own philosophy of liberty, I was in chains. Roman chains. The kind that leave marks on the wrists that do not entirely heal. Jefferson, you held people in bondage from the comfort of Monticello. I wrote about bondage from inside it. I want you to sit with the distance between those two positions before you use my words as your defense. Now, what I actually wrote? I wrote to Philemon a letter you did not cite, and I noticed you did not cite it, asking him to receive Onesimus back, not as a slave. I wrote the words precisely, no longer as a slave, but better than a slave, as a dear brother. I was asking a master to see a man he owned as a brother. I was asking him to do, in one relationship, in one household, what James is asking this entire civilization to do. I could not compel him. I had no army, no legislature, no executive power. I had a letter and the authority of love, and the hope that it would be enough. It often was not enough. I know that. I also wrote, and you did not cite this either, Jefferson to the Galatians. There is neither Jew nor Greek. There is neither slave nor free. There is neither male nor female. For you are all one in Christ Jesus. That sentence is the seed. The household codes are the accommodation to a world that had not yet grown into the seed. I was writing to communities of the powerless, trying to survive under an empire that executed people for the content of their beliefs. I was not writing a political constitution for a nation with the power to make law. I was writing survival instructions to people who had no power whatsoever, and telling them that their dignity before God was absolute, even when the world around them said otherwise. You have taken my accommodation to the powerless and handed it to the powerful as permission. That is not what I wrote. I wrote to the Onesimuses of the world, not to their masters as justification. To their masters when I wrote to their masters as a plea, as Philemon, as a brother, receive him as you would receive me. But I will not stand here and tell you that I bear no responsibility for what was done with my words, that the absence of a clear and thundering declaration, this institution is evil, abolish it entirely, now has no cost. It has a cost. The people who paid it were not in this room and were not consulted. Here's the difference I want this room to understand between what I failed to do and what Jefferson failed to do. I failed to say clearly enough what Galatians already contained. I accommodated a world I had no power to change and trusted the seed to do its work. I was wrong that the seed would be sufficient without a clearer word. I accept that. Jefferson had the power, Jefferson had the pen, the presidency, the platform, the moment, the specific, unrepeatable historical moment when the words, all men are created equal, were so new and so electric that they might have been made to mean what they said. He did not use that power. He used it to write the principle, and then he went home to the people. The principle was written against. I wrote from chains about freedom. Jefferson wrote about chains from freedom. That is not the same failure.
I want to speak carefully here because this question sits at the center of everything I have given my life to. And I am aware that careful speech is not always what a room wants when the questions are urgent. But I ask your patience because I believe the answer to what went wrong with the church and what would need to change requires that we first understand what the church actually is before we can diagnose what it has failed to be. The church is not primarily an institution. I say this as a man who has spent his entire ministry defending institutional order, so I ask you to hear the precision of it. The church is a body. Paul used this word, and he meant it literally, not metaphorically, not rhetorically, but as a description of a living organism in which every part is necessary to every other part, in which the suffering of one member is the suffering of all, in which the health of the whole depends on the function of each. A body does not vote on whether the hand feeds the mouth. It does not calculate whether the eye benefits sufficiently from the foot's labor. It functions as one thing, or it does not function at all. What has prevented the church from being the institution your question describes? I will answer directly. The church has forgotten that it is a body and begun to behave as a collection of individuals who share certain opinions. This is the foundational failure from which every other failure proceeds. When I wrote to the Corinthians, and I wrote because a church had expelled its elders without cause, because factions had formed around personalities rather than around Christ, because the community had mistaken its preferences for its convictions, I was not writing about a bureaucratic problem. I was writing about a body that had begun to cannibalize itself. The elders who were removed had served faithfully. They were removed because a newer, louder faction found them inconvenient. The community had forgotten that its unity was not a byproduct of its agreement. Its unity was its testimony. A divided church does not merely function poorly. A divided church tells the watching world that what it proclaims is not true, that the love it announces cannot actually hold human beings together across their differences. This is the first thing that must be recovered. The understanding that the church's unity is not organizational, it is theological. It means something about the nature of God and the nature of the human person, that these people who would not naturally choose each other, who come from different classes and different nations and different traditions, remain together in genuine community across genuine disagreement. When the church splits, and it has split, repeatedly, catastrophically, it does not merely lose members, it loses its primary argument. The second thing that must be recovered, the understanding that authority in the church exists to save the body, not to protect itself. I defended apostolic succession not because I believe hierarchy was intrinsically valuable, but because I believe the community needed continuity, needed a thread of teaching and practice and accountability that runs from one generation to the next and prevents each new generation from reinventing everything from scratch, usually badly. Authority in the church is stewardship. When it becomes possession, when the bishop protects his position rather than his community, when the institution protects its reputation rather than its people, the body begins to die from the head down. Mr. Jefferson asked what prevented the church from condemning slavery across 17 centuries. Mr. Paul answered him from his own experience. I want to answer him from the institution's experience, power. The church that held authority in those centuries had made a transaction, the same transaction General Washington described refusing at Newburgh. It had accepted a crown. It had fused its authority with imperial power, with state sanction, with the ability to compel rather than persuade. And in making that transaction, it had acquired exactly what it should never have sought and lost exactly what it cannot function without: the credibility of a community that serves without reward, that loves without condition, that speaks truth without the protection of power behind it. The church that becomes an instrument of the state loses its voice the moment the state needs to be told something it does not want to hear, and the state always eventually needs to be told something it does not want to hear. Here then is what I believe genuine reinvigoration requires. And I say this to the church before I say it to anyone else in this room, because the church cannot ask government for partnership it has not yet earned from its own people. The church must recover its practice before it recovers its influence. the order of these matters enormously. A church that seeks influence without practice is what James has been describing, the man who says to the cold and hungry brother, "Go in peace, be warm and filled," without giving the things needed. The church has done this. It has spoken about the poor more eloquently than almost any institution in human history, and served them with less consistency than its own words required. The watching world has noticed. The watching world has been noticing for a long time. The practice comes first. The community that actually visits the widow, the community that actually receives the stranger, the community that actually holds the powerful accountable within its own walls before demanding accountability from the powers outside them. The community that argues, and here I think Hillel has said something the church needs to hear, that argues honestly about what it believes, that does not suppress the hard question in the name of unity, but learns to hold the hard question inside the community rather than expelling it. When the church has done this, when it has recovered the practice of being an actual body rather than a collection of like-minded individuals, then it will have something to offer the republic that no government can manufacture and no wall can provide. It will have the demonstration that human beings can actually live this way together across every line that would otherwise divide them. That demonstration is the church's irreplaceable contribution to civilization, not its arguments, not its political influence, not its institutional authority, its life.
Clement has said something I want to carry forward before I add to it, because it deserves to be heard clearly. The Church's unity is its testimony. When the Church divides, not over genuine matters of truth, but over preference, personality, the accumulation of factional grievance, it does not merely malfunction, it lies. It tells the world that the love it proclaims cannot actually do what it claims to be able to do. I have spent my life inside that testimony, watching it hold and watching it fail, and I can tell you that Clement is correct. The failure is theological before it is institutional. But I want to go somewhere Clement did not go because I think the room needs to hear it. The question asks, what has prevented the Church from being the institution it should be? Clement named the imperial transaction the moment the Church accepted the crown, fused its authority with state power, and lost the prophetic distance that made it capable of telling the powerful what they did not want to hear. He is right. I watched the consequences of that transaction from the inside. I served in a church that had already made it, that was still making it, that was making it again in new forms every generation, under new emperors, with new demands. But I want to name something that sits beneath the imperial transaction, something that made the Church vulnerable to it in the first place. The Church accepted the crown because it wanted to win. Not to serve, to win, to see its vision of the good society realized, to watch the empire become Christian, the law become just, the poor become protected, the pagans become converted. These are not wicked desires. They are in many respects exactly the desires this debate has been trying to give institutional form. But the desire to win, the desire to see the good, achieved through the acquisition of sufficient power, is the precise point at which the Church became susceptible to the earthly city's deepest temptation, because the earthly city always offers the Church the same bargain: take the power, achieve the good, accept our terms. And the terms always include, buried in the fine print, the requirement that the Church become what it was supposed to redeem. I know this from my own life before I know it from history. I was a man who wanted to win arguments before I was a man who wanted to love people. I was brilliant at winning arguments. I could dismantle any position, construct any counter, find the flaw in any framework. I did this for years in the service of philosophies that were ultimately empty, and I did it with considerable satisfaction. What I could not do, what I did not know how to do, was stop, in the way James means, for the person in front of me with my actual body, regardless of whether winning them served any larger argument. The conversion I experienced was not primarily intellectual, it was the reorientation of love. I had been loving the wrong things in the wrong order, loving my reputation, my argument, my vision of what I would achieve, and what happened to me was that the order changed, not all at once, over years, painfully, with many reversions. This is what I believe the Church's reinvigoration actually requires, and it is more demanding than anything Clement has described, because institutional reform is comprehensible, and this is not. The Church requires the reorientation of its loves, not better programs, not stronger structure, not wiser leadership, though all of these matter. The Church requires communities of people who have genuinely undergone what I underwent, whose loves have been reordered, who want what God wants in the order God wants it, who have been freed from the specific compulsion to win that makes the imperial transaction so attractive. Because a church full of people whose loves are rightly ordered does not need to be told to visit the widow. It goes. It does not need to be instructed to tell the powerful, uncomfortable truths. It cannot stay quiet. It does not need a program for serving all rather than only its own, because it has ceased to experience the distinction between its own and the other as the primary organizing principle of its life. I hear the political men in this room thinking, this is not actionable. You cannot legislate the reorientation of love. You cannot design an institution that produces it reliably. You are correct. I am not offering you a mechanism. I am offering you a diagnosis, and the diagnosis is this. Every mechanism you design to make the church more effective without addressing the order of its loves will eventually be captured by the same disease it was designed to cure. You will build a more efficient instrument for the pursuit of institutional victory and call it reinvigoration. The early church, the church before the crown, the church Paul built in specific cities with specific people who had undergone specific transformations, was not effective by any measure the earthly city recognizes. It had no buildings, no endowments, no political allies, no coercive authority. What it had was communities of people who had genuinely decided that the person in front of them mattered more than the argument they were winning, the position they were protecting, the influence they were accumulating, and it turned the world over, not by acquiring power, by demonstrating in specific rooms, on specific days, with specific hungry and frightened and outcast people, that love rightly ordered is the most transformative force in human experience. Clement is right that the church must recover its practice before it recovers its influence. I want to add one thing beneath the practice. The church must recover its hunger, not for influence, not for political partnership, not even for the good society, though the good society is worth wanting. Its hunger for God, which is, in my experience, the only hunger that produces the kind of love that actually does what James is asking of it. A church that is hungry for God does not walk past the man in the field, not because it has been instructed not to, because it has been transformed into the kind of community that cannot. That transformation is not something government can partner with in any conventional sense. It is something government can protect the conditions for, can refuse to corrupt, can leave room for. But it cannot be designed, legislated, or institutionalized from the outside. It must happen inside the church first. One person at a time, in the order I have described. The reorientation of love. Everything else follows from that, or it does not hold.
Augustine has named the disease precisely: the desire to win, the love turned inward toward the institution's own survival, its own influence, its own vision of the good, achieved through the acquisition of sufficient power. He is correct. And he is correct that you cannot design a mechanism that cures it. But I want to speak to something Augustine described from the outside that I experienced from the inside, because I think the inside account is where the practical answer lives. I was not converted from wickedness. I want this room to understand that clearly, because the nature of what happened to me matters for everything I am about to say. I was not a wicked man on the road to Damascus. I was a righteous man. I was, by every measure my tradition possessed, exemplary, circumcised on the 8th day, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews. As to the law, a Pharisee. As to zeal, and here is the word that matters, as to zeal, a persecutor of the church. As to righteousness under the law, blameless. I was blameless, and I was destroying people. Not from malice, from certainty, from the absolute conviction that my vision of what God required was correct, and that those who threatened it deserved whatever I brought to them. I held the coats of the men who stoned Stephen. I watched a man die for his testimony, and I believed I was doing God a service. What happened on the Damascus road was not that I became good. It was that I was interrupted. The love I had been directing at my tradition, at my righteousness, at my vision of what faithfulness required, was interrupted by a light I could not argue with, and a voice that asked me a question I could not answer. Why are you persecuting me? Not, why are you persecuting them? Me. Every person I had dragged to prison, every family I had scattered, every community I had dismantled, the voice identified with all of them. Not as their advocate, as them. Augustine calls this the reorientation of love. He is theologically precise. What I would say from the inside is simpler. I discovered that the person I was certain I was serving was already present in the people I was destroying, and that discovery made everything I had been before that moment available for a completely different purpose. Now, what does this mean for the question before us? The church that Clement is asking us to rebuild, the church that James is asking us to become, requires communities in which this interruption is possible, in which people can be stopped, reoriented, redirected toward the person in front of them rather than the vision of the good they are pursuing over that person's head. Let me tell you what I actually built. Not in theory, in practice. I built communities in houses, not in temples, not in civic buildings, not in institutions with endowments and hierarchies and the accumulated weight of establishment. In houses, Lydia's house in Philippi, Priscilla and Aquila's house in Corinth, Nympha's house in Colossae. These were communities small enough that you could not walk past the suffering member. You sat with them at the same table, you ate the same bread, you knew when someone had not eaten because they were there in the room, visibly hungry. And the bread was on the table between you. The size mattered. I cannot overstate this. The size of the community is not an organizational preference. It is a theological statement about how love actually functions. Love functions at the scale where the person is visible, where their name is known, where their absence is noticed, where the gap between what is proclaimed and what is practiced is small enough that the community itself experiences the hypocrisy as pain and corrects it because the pain is unbearable. When the church grew beyond that scale without replicating that intimacy, when it became an institution that administered to people rather than a body that lived with them, it lost the self-correcting mechanism that kept it honest. Not because the leaders became wicked, because the suffering became invisible. You cannot walk past what you cannot see. This is the first practical answer I want to give this room. The reinvigorated church is a church of communities small enough to see each other. Not small churches that are merely shrunken versions of large ones. Small communities within whatever structure exists, where the name of every suffering person is known, and the gap between proclamation and practice produces immediate, local, unavoidable accountability. The second thing I built, and I built it with enormous effort across enormous distances, and it cost me more than I expected, was connection between communities. The collection for Jerusalem, The letters carried from church to church. The network of houses that formed the body across the entire Mediterranean, precisely because they were connected to each other across every line that would otherwise have made them strangers. Jew and Greek, slave and free, merchant and laborer, Roman citizen and provincial. These were not natural companions. They were made companions by the specific practice of gathering around the same table, proclaiming the same Lord, and being held accountable to the same standard of love. This is the second practical answer. The reinvigorated church is a network of intimate communities connected to each other across difference, not a homogeneous congregation of like-minded people who find each other's company congenial. A body Clement's word, my word, in which the parts that would not naturally choose each other are held together by something stronger than preference. And here is what that body does for the Republic these men have been trying to build. It demonstrates the thing the Republic most needs demonstrated, that human beings can actually live across their differences without destroying each other, not by suppressing the differences, not by pretending they do not exist, but by being held together by a love that is stronger than the differences, that names the differences honestly and refuses to let them be the final word. Jefferson's wall protects the space for this to happen. Madison's extended republic creates the political conditions under which it can multiply. Hamilton's institutions provide the stability within which it can grow. But none of these produce it. None of them can. The church produces it. Or it should. Or it was always meant to. What has prevented it? What Augustine named the desire to win, the imperial transaction, the corruption of authority into self-protection. What I would add, the loss of the house, the loss of the table, the loss of the scale at which love is not a principle but a practice that operates on specific people in specific rooms with specific bread. What would reinvigoration require? Go back to the house, not as nostalgia, not as antiquarianism, as a theological commitment to the scale at which the church has always done its most honest work, the scale at which the hungry person is visible, the scale at which hypocrisy produces immediate pain, the scale at which the stranger becomes a brother before the institution has had time to classify him as an outsider. The government cannot build this. The government can protect it. The government can refuse to crush it. The government can look at what these communities produce. The citizens James is describing, the people who stop, who tell the truth, who serve all rather than only their own, and recognize in them the moral formation Hamilton is asking for, the voluntary community Jefferson is defending, the demonstrated love Augustine is prescribing. But the building happens in the house, at the table, with the bread. It always did.
Paul has given me what I have been waiting for since James first asked his question, and I want to build on it precisely because I think this room has been conducting two conversations that belong together and have not yet been joined. The first conversation is theological. Augustine, Clement, Paul, James, what the church must become from the inside. The reorientation of love, the recovery of the house, the table, the name known, the suffering visible. This conversation has been conducted with extraordinary depth, and I will not pretend to match it on its own ground. The second conversation is constitutional. What government does, what it protects, what it enables, what it must refuse even when the temptation is to help. This has been my ground throughout this debate, and I want to stand on it now, not in opposition to what Paul has said, but in deliberate connection to it. Paul described a network, houses connected across the Mediterranean, Lydia's house, Priscilla and Aquila's house, communities small enough that the suffering person was visible, connected to each other across every difference that would otherwise make them strangers. He built this network without a government's help, under active government persecution, against the full coercive weight of Rome. I want this room to sit with that for a moment. Paul built the most transformative moral formation network in the history of Western civilization, the network that produced, over several centuries, the communities Augustine joined and Clement organized and James led in Jerusalem without a single favorable law, without a single government contract, without a single institutional partner in any seat of power anywhere. He built it in houses, with bread, at personal cost, that ended in his execution. Now, what does this mean for the question of government partnership? It means government's first and most important contribution to the Church's reinvigoration is the most modest thing any government has ever been asked to do: stay out of the way. I do not mean this in Jefferson's sense, the wall as philosophical principle, the state's formal neutrality as the highest aspiration. I mean it practically, specifically, institutionally. Government must actively resist every temptation to help the Church in ways that corrupt it. And the temptations are real, and they are numerous, and they arrive dressed as partnership. Tax preference that creates financial dependency, legislative favor that creates political obligation, public endorsement that creates reputational investment in the government's own legitimacy. Every one of these feels like support. Every one of them is Clement's imperial transaction in a new set of clothes. Every one of them introduces into the Church exactly the incentive that corrupts it. The incentive to maintain its relationship with power rather than to speak honestly to it. If government wants a church capable of forming the citizens a republic needs, government must be willing to be told by that church things it does not want to hear. And a church that is financially dependent on government favor, that has made its institutional survival contingent on the continuation of that favor, cannot tell government what it does not want to hear. It has traded away the capacity on the day it accepted the first preferential arrangement. This is harder than it sounds, because the church will ask for help. The church that is doing genuine work, feeding the hungry, housing the stranger, educating the children no one else is educating, will come to government and say, "We need resources to do this work, and we have proven we can do it better than your institutions can." And they will often be correct. And every political instinct I possess says, fund what works. But the funding changes what it touches, not immediately, not visibly, over time, in the accumulated weight of what cannot be said to the funder without risk, in the programs that must be maintained to justify the budget, in the leaders who learn to speak the language of grant applications rather than the language of profits. The church that accepts government funding to do government's work is not a partner. It is a contractor. And contractors do not tell their clients that the building they are asking for should not be built. The partnership, I believe, is possible. And I believe it is possible. I am not counseling. Despair is a partnership of parallel purpose rather than institutional fusion. The church forms citizens. Government protects the conditions in which that formation can happen. The church feeds the hungry. Government maintains the stability and rule of law within which the church can operate. The church tells the powerful what they do not want to hear. Government, if it has the character Washington is describing, receives that word and acts on it. These are parallel tracks that must remain parallel. The moment they merge, both are corrupted. The church loses its voice. Government loses its conscience. Now, in here, I want to say something practical that I do not think has been said clearly enough in this debate. The Republic needs the church's output. It cannot produce that output itself. It has tried. Every attempt to produce civic virtue through state mechanisms alone has produced, at best, a pale imitation of the formation that genuine religious community generates, and at worst, the Caesar worship Paul warned us against. Government knows this, even when it will not say it. The quiet truth of every republic that has lasted is that it has been sustained by communities it did not build and cannot replace. What government can do, what I believe government must do, is structure its own institutions to make room for what Paul is describing. Tax structures that protect the independence of religious communities without creating dependency. Legal frameworks that allow the house church network to operate without the institutional overhead that crushes small communities. Public acknowledgement, not establishment, not endorsement, but honest public acknowledgement that the moral formation the Republic requires comes from communities it cannot manufacture and must therefore protect. Jefferson's wall is necessary. I have come, over the course of this debate, to believe it more fully than I did when we began. But a wall is not a partnership. A wall is a boundary. The question of partnership is what happens on both sides of it, what the church does on its side, and what government does on its side, and how the output of one flows into the life of the other without the institutions themselves merging. Paul built his network in houses without government help. He is right that this is the model. What I want to add, and it is the contribution of a man who spent his life building institutions, is that the Republic's job is to ensure that in the centuries after Paul, the houses are still standing, that the network can still function, that the bread is still on the table, that the stranger at the door of Lydia's house is still received rather than deported or imprisoned or classified as a threat to the established order. The more perfect union protects the house. It does not build what happens inside it. That is the church's work, and it is the most important work being done in the Republic, whether the Republic knows it or not.
Hamilton, you have said the truest political thing spoken in this room today, and I want to receive it before I add to it. Protect the house. Do not try to build what happens inside it. Yes, this is right, and I want to speak about what happens inside it, not as principle, not as a new idea the assembly invented, but as what was already written, already commanded, already given to us long before my brother walked into the Jordan to be immersed by John, because I think there is something this room needs to understand about the house we built in Jerusalem. We did not build it from new materials. We built it from Torah, every beam of it, the obligation to the widow. Written, Deuteronomy says it plainly, the Lord executes justice for the fatherless and the widow, and loves the sojourner, giving him food and clothing. This was not a principle we derived from my brother's teaching. It was the commandment we were already under. My brother did not invent the obligation. He embodied it. He showed us what it looked like when a person actually did what Moses had commanded, rather than finding sophisticated reasons why the circumstances of this particular widow did not quite trigger the requirement, the obligation to the stranger. Written, you shall love the stranger as yourself, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. When the stranger arrived at the door of our assembly in Jerusalem, we did not receive him because we were a welcoming community with an open culture. We received him because the Torah commanded it, and because my brother had made clear that this commandment was not negotiable. The stranger was not a charitable opportunity. The stranger had a claim on us written into the covenant itself. The wages of the laborer. Written, you shall not oppress a hired worker who is poor and needy. His wages shall not remain with you all night until morning. This is not a labor principle. This is Torah. When I wrote to the communities scattered abroad about the rich keeping back the wages of those who mowed their fields, I was not making a new argument. I was reminding them of what was already written, what had always been written, what they were already accountable to, whether or not they found my letter persuasive. This is what the house requires before it requires anything else. A community that understands its obligations to the poor, the stranger, the widow, the orphan, the laborer, not as expressions of its values, not as initiatives it has chosen to prioritize, not as the charitable impulse of generous people, but as commandments, as binding as any other commandment, as non-negotiable as Sabbath. The reason this distinction matters enormously for what Hamilton is trying to protect is this: a community that practices charity toward the poor will do so when it feels moved to, and find reasons to excuse itself when it does not. A community that understands these obligations as Torah, as the direct commandment of the God who brought Israel out of Egypt, who said, "You know the heart of the stranger because you were strangers," that community cannot excuse itself without acknowledging that it is not doing what God said. The standard is not its own feeling. The standard is written down, outside the community, above its preferences, not subject to revision based on what is comfortable this season. When the Greek-speaking widows were being overlooked in the daily distribution, and this happened quickly, before the assembly had grown very large, I did not preach a sermon about the importance of inclusion. The Torah had already preached that sermon. What was needed was structure. The appointment of 7 men whose specific daily responsibility was to ensure the commandment was actually being kept. Not celebrated, kept. Because a commandment that is celebrated but not kept is worse than useless. It is a testimony against the community that holds it. I spent considerable time on my knees before each day began. I am told my knees showed it. What I want to say about that practice is this: the prayer was not separate from the Torah. The Torah was what I was praying about. Specifically, the commandments the community was keeping. The commandments it was failing. The specific person whose situation was the occasion for a specific commandment being either honored or ignored. The prayer produced names because the Torah had already specified the categories widow, orphan, stranger, laborer, and the names were the specific people in those categories whose faces I needed to be reminded of before the day filled with everything that would otherwise consume my attention. My brother said he did not come to abolish the Torah or the prophets, but to fulfill them. I want this room to understand what I believe he meant by that, because I think it is the answer to Hamilton's question about what the house actually produces. He meant that the Torah's vision of a community in which the gleaning law ensures the poor have access to the harvest's edges, in which the sabbatical year cancels the accumulated debt that grinds the poor person down, in which the wages are paid before sundown because the laborer is poor and sets his heart on it. This vision was not a historical arrangement that had been superseded. It was the target, the destination the covenant had always been moving toward. And the community gathered around him was meant to be the demonstration that this kind of life was actually possible. Not as a future hope, as a present practice. The house that the Republic needs to protect is a house where this is not inspiration, where it is instruction, where the poor person who comes to the door is not received as the occasion for the community's generosity, but as the occasion for the community's obedience to what was written long before any of us arrived in this room. That is what we built in Jerusalem. That is what I believe the house must recover. Not new values, the commandments that were always there, kept, actually kept, by specific people, on specific days, for specific persons whose names are known. That is where the Republic's formation begins. And it begins there whether the Republic knows it or not.
James has said something I cannot dismiss and cannot yet fully embrace, and I want to be honest about both: the argument for a fixed external standard, something written, received, non-negotiable, above the community's preferences and not subject to revision based on what is convenient this season. This I understand completely. This is the argument I have been making in different language throughout this entire debate. You cannot sustain Republican institutions on the shifting ground of popular sentiment alone. You need something above the majority, something the majority did not write and cannot unmake. What James is pointing to in Torah, the widow's claim as commandment rather than charity, the laborer's wages as obligation rather than generosity, the stranger's reception as covenant duty rather than cultural preference, this is precisely the kind of fixed standard I have been describing as the load-bearing structure beneath Republican virtue. I recognize it. I find it compelling in its architecture. Where I find myself uncertain, and I want to sit with this uncertainty honestly rather than resolve it prematurely, is here. The communities this republic is built from did not come to these shores carrying Torah as their native framework. They carried other things, natural law, as Cicero articulated it, the accumulated moral tradition of English common law, the Protestant inheritance, which is itself a complicated and partial transmission of something older. Some carried the specific covenant theology of the Puritans, and I think that tradition deserves more attention in this conversation than it has received, but even that is a translation rather than the original. My question is not whether James is right that Torah provides exactly the kind of external, non-negotiable standard a covenant community requires. I think he is right. My question is whether a republic of many peoples, formed from many traditions, can be organized around a specific received text that most of its citizens did not receive. And if not, if Torah, as the specific vehicle, is not available to the whole republic, then what is the functional equivalent? What performs the same structural role for communities that are not Jewish and are not organized around the specific covenant James is describing? Natural law has been my answer throughout this debate. The accumulated moral wisdom of civilization, accessible to reason, expressed through common law and constitutional structure. But I will admit, and James's argument has pressed me to admit it, that natural law, as I have understood and deployed it, tends toward the philosophical. It produces principles. It does not always produce the specific, operational, daily obligation that James is describing. It does not tell you that the wages must be paid before sundown. It does not specify that you must leave the edges of the field. It gestures toward justice without always naming what justice requires at the level of the specific transaction on the specific day. I am mulling this. I do not have a clean answer. I am a man who has spent his life building structures, and I am sitting with the recognition that the structure James has described has been field tested across 3,000 years in a way that nothing I built in Philadelphia has yet been tested.
I want to come in here because Hamilton has just described something I recognize, and I think I recognize it from a direction he does not. I grew up in Puritan, Massachusetts, not as a distant cultural inheritance, but as the air I breathed. The covenant theology that shaped that world was not a vague Christian piety. It was a specific attempt to build a community around exactly what James has described the Hebrew Bible as the operating charter. The poor as covenant members with specific rights, the obligations of the community as commandments rather than charitable impulses. John Cotton attempted to base Massachusetts civil law directly on the Mosaic Code. The men who built that colony called themselves the New Israel. They did not mean this as a metaphor. They meant that the covenant God made with Israel at Sinai was the model, the specific, operational model for what a covenant community in the New World should look like. They read Deuteronomy the way Hamilton reads Blackstone. As the law, they were not wrong in their instinct, even when they were wrong in their application. And they were sometimes wrong in their application. The history of Puritan New England includes chapters I will not pretend were faithful to what James is describing. The stranger was not always received. The widow was not always seen. The covenant language was sometimes used to justify exactly the kind of factional self-protection Augustine warned against. But the instinct was right. The instinct that a community requires an external, written, received standard above its own preferences. A standard it did not write and cannot rewrite. This is not a novel idea imported from Jerusalem. It is the idea that built the communities that eventually built this republic. The communities Hamilton is trying to protect with his constitutional architecture were themselves built on a prior architecture that came directly from what James is describing. What Hamilton calls natural law and what James calls Torah are not the same thing, but they are reaching toward the same structural reality. The community must answer to something above itself, something written, something specific enough to be kept or broken, rather than merely aspired to. The Puritans tried to carry Torah's civil logic into a new world. They succeeded enough to produce communities that knew what they owed each other. They failed enough that we needed a constitution to correct what their covenant exclusions had produced. But the failure was not in reaching for the external standard. The failure was in applying it too narrowly to their own covenant members and not to the stranger at the door, which is precisely the commandment James has said is non-negotiable. Paul, I want to hear from you, because I have a question that Hamilton's mulling has produced, and that my Puritan inheritance raises without answering. When the Jerusalem Council met, when you and James and the others sat down to decide what would be required of the Gentiles coming into the community, what was the expectation? Were they released from Torah entirely, or was something else intended that was not fully transmitted?
John Adams has asked exactly the right question, and I want to answer it as precisely as I know how, because I think the answer changes something in this debate that has not yet been changed. When we gathered in Jerusalem, James was there, Peter was there, the elders were there. The question before us was specific. What do you require of Gentiles who are turning to God? The party that had come up from Judea was saying, circumcise them, require full Torah observance from the beginning. Make them Jews before you make them disciples. We said no, not because Torah was being set aside, because we had watched what God was doing among the Gentiles, and we understood that the entry point could not be the full weight of a covenant identity that takes a lifetime to form. The decision we reached was this: 4 requirements. Abstain from things polluted by idols. Abstain from sexual immorality. Abstain from things strangled. Abstain from blood. I want to say what these 4 requirements actually were, because they have been misread for centuries as arbitrary hygiene regulations or as the minimum below, which Gentile behavior was simply unacceptable. They were not that. These 4 requirements were the foundation, the on-ramp, the beginning of something that was expected to continue. And here is the verse that has been almost entirely overlooked in every subsequent discussion of that council's decision. James himself said it immediately after the 4 requirements were announced. He said, "For Moses has been preached in every city from the earliest times, and is read in the synagogues on every Sabbath." Do you hear what he is saying? He is saying, we are not releasing the Gentiles from Torah. We are establishing the minimum that allows them to enter the community where Torah is read every week. The expectation was that they would hear Moses, that they would continue to hear Moses, that the 4 requirements were the door, and the synagogue was the room beyond the door, where the ongoing formation would happen. The Gentile who came into the community under Acts 15 was not exempt from the gleaning law's logic. They were not released from the obligation to the widow and the stranger and the laborer. They were given time, they were given the community. They were given weekly exposure to the text that carried those obligations. The assumption was that the text would do its work across time as it had always done its work, through regular reading, through communal argument about its application, through the slow formation of people who heard it often enough that it became native to them. What broke down was not the 4 requirements. What broke down was the synagogue. When the communities I planted severed their connection to the Jewish world, when the reading of Moses on the Sabbath ceased to be the formation mechanism, the on-ramp remained, but the road it led to was gone. The 4 requirements became the ceiling rather than the floor. The minimum became the maximum. And the full weight of what James is describing, the gleaning law, the sabbatical logic, the specific daily obligation to the widow and the stranger and the laborer, became inspiration rather than instruction. Hamilton has asked what performs the same structural role for communities that are not Jewish and are not organized around Torah as their received covenant. I want to say something about that question that Acts 15 makes possible. The answer the Jerusalem Council gave was the community itself, the reading community, the community that gathers weekly around the text, that argues about its application, that forms its members through repeated exposure to the specific obligations the text names. The vehicle was not Torah handed to Gentiles as a legal code external to their experience. The vehicle was the community gathered around Torah Jew and Gentile together, in which the Gentile heard what the Jew already carried in the bone, and was slowly formed by the hearing into someone for whom the obligation to the widow was no longer foreign instruction, but native conviction. This is what Adams's Puritans were trying to reconstruct. They had lost the Jewish community that was the original vehicle. They tried to rebuild the vehicle from the text alone, from the Hebrew Bible, read in congregations, preached from pulpits, applied to civil life. They succeeded enough to produce communities with genuine covenant identity and genuine obligation to each other. They failed, where James said the failure always happens in their treatment of the stranger, the one the covenant most specifically protects, and whom the covenant community most consistently fails, when it mistakes its own membership for the boundary of its obligation. Hamilton. What performs the structural role of Torah for communities not organized around it? The answer Acts 15 gives is this: the community gathered around the text, not the text alone, the community, the reading, the argument, the weekly return to what was written, the slow formation of people who have heard it often enough that the widow's claim is no longer a principle they assent to, but an obligation they cannot ignore. The Republic cannot build this community. Hamilton is right. But the Republic can protect the conditions in which it forms. And the most important condition is this: the community must remain connected to the text that formed it. The moment it severs that connection, the moment the reading stops, the argument stops, the formation stops, what remains is exactly what James warned against. The faith without the works, the principle without the practice, the house with no one in it who knows what the house is for.